In the lawyer's office, my son smirked. $900,000 are mine. You are nothing. I don't need a mother anymore. The words, colder and sharper than the sterile glass of the skyscraper that imprisoned us, hung in the silent air. They were a perfectly polished monument to a love I had tragically mistaken for unconditional. I, Eleanor Vance, a 64-year-old grandmother whose hands bore the roadmap of a life spent baking birthday cakes, mending scraped knees, and knitting a galaxy of tiny, hopeful sweaters, was being summarily deleted from my own existence. My son, David, sat opposite me, encased in a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed to hold him in contemptuous embrace. I had built this man from bedtime stories and patient lessons, from scraped knees and a bottomless well of encouragement. Now his smile was a razor's edge, and his eyes, once perfect mirrors of my own, were opaque, shuttered windows to a soul I no longer recognized, a stranger I had somehow birthed. The lawyer, a Mr. Alastair Finch, whose suit seemed woven from threads of pure, distilled avarice, cleared his throat. The sound, a dry rustle of paper and indifference, echoed his gaze as it flitted between us, as if he were watching a particularly riveting, if brutal, tennis match. As per the primary stipulations of your late husband's, Richard Vance's, last will and testament, he intoned, his voice as desiccated as the ancient legal tomes lining his shelves, the entirety of the inheritance, comprised of assets valued at approximately $900,000, is to be transferred, in full, to your son, Mr. David Vance. He paused, a maestro of cruel timing, letting the weight of the pronouncement settle upon me, a leaden shroud. There is, however, he continued, peering over his spectacles, a small, shall we say, provision. A storm cloud, brief but violent, passed over David's triumphant face. He leaned forward, his polished Italian leather shoes squeaking a complaint against the glossy marble floor. A provision? What kind of provision? My father was a straightforward man. Alastair Finch adjusted his glasses, a slow, deliberate movement designed to prolong the tension. Indeed. It is a handwritten addendum, appended to the will and witnessed by his nurse on the day before his passing. It states, and I quote, "Should my beloved wife, Eleanor, ever find herself in a position of demonstrated financial distress, it is my final wish that our son, David, provide her with a monthly allowance of $100 for the remainder of her natural life." A sound tore from David's throat, not a laugh, but a harsh, grating bark of derision that ricocheted off the cold, impersonal surfaces of the office. $100? He scoffed, turning the full force of his contempt upon me. $100 a month to the woman who liquidated her own savings to pay for my university education, who co-signed the loan for my first design studio, who gifted me the down payment for the house Jennifer and I now live in. How touchingly generous of him. Of you. His eyes, chips of blue ice, locked with mine. Well, mother, I suppose you won't starve. You can buy a great deal of cat food with that. He rose, smoothing down his jacket. The meeting, for him, was concluded. My life, as I knew it, was concluded. I remained silent, a statue carved from a grief so profound it had fossilized into stone. The shock was a physical blow, a phantom fist to the gut that stole my breath and left me gasping in the vacuum of my son's hatred. But deep beneath the permafrost of that shock, another emotion began to stir. It was a slow, creeping burn that started in the pit of my stomach, a geothermal heat spreading outwards, thawing my frozen limbs, coaxing blood back into my veins. It was an emotion I had not truly felt in decades, an emotion I had meticulously buried beneath layers of motherly love, societal politeness, and the gentle expectations of a quiet suburban life. It was rage. Pure, incandescent, and terrifyingly lucid. The journey home in a taxi, my own car, had been a shared asset, and thus, now David's, was a surreal passage through a world rendered alien. The familiar, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood seemed to mock me, the cheerful facades of the houses hiding secrets and sorrows I had never before bothered to consider. My own home, the place where Richard and I had woven a life together, the sanctuary I had so carefully curated with warmth and love, now felt cavernous and cold, a mausoleum haunted by the ghost of a future I had so naively believed was my right. I sank into my favorite armchair, the one with the worn chintz fabric that Richard had always claimed was molded perfectly to the contours of human contentment. I stared at the gallery of silver-framed photographs on the mantelpiece. Richard, his arms slung around a much younger, happier me on our honeymoon in Venice. David, a gap-toothed 7-year-old, beaming with pride as he held up a chaotic finger painting of a lopsided house and 2 stick figures, Mommy and Daddy. Graduations, family vacations, birthday parties, a lifetime of meticulously curated memories, now poisoned by the bitter, metallic taste of betrayal. The first few weeks were an exercise in controlled descent. The $100 allowance arrived not with a note, not even in a personal envelope, but through a cold, anonymous bank transfer, a monthly digital flick of contempt. I was forced to learn a new and brutal arithmetic, the calculus of survival. I learned to water down the soup, to buy the bruised fruit, to mend clothes until they were more thread than fabric. I swallowed my pride, a bitter pill that lodged permanently in my throat, and endured the pitying glances of the cashier at the local grocery store as I counted out my change. I sold my jewelry, piece by painful piece. First, the diamond earrings Richard had bought me for our 25th anniversary, then the delicate sapphire necklace that had been my own mother's. Each sale was a small death, another severance from the woman I used to be. The final and most painful was Richard's gold watch. As the jeweler counted out the bills, I felt the last tangible link to my old life break. But as the initial waves of shock and despair receded, they left behind a shoreline of hard, unyielding resolve. The rage had not dissipated, it had clarified, hardening from a molten emotion into a sharpened tool. I began my new life's work. My first project was David. I became a ghost in his periphery. Old age, I discovered, was a remarkable cloak of invisibility. No one notices an elderly woman sitting on a park bench for hours, or browsing aimlessly in a coffee shop, or reading a newspaper in the lobby of an office building. I learned his routines, the precise time he left his architectural firm, the gym he visited on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the upscale bar where he entertained clients. I followed his wife, Jennifer, a woman whose ambition was exceeded only by her appetite for luxury. I observed her weekly spa days, her lunches with friends where laughter and gossip flowed as freely as the Chablis, her shopping sprees at designer boutiques. I saw where their money went. I saw the casual, thoughtless opulence, and with every exquisitely wrapped purchase she made, another brick was laid on the foundation of my fury. Through meticulous observation and hours spent at the public library, learning the art of navigating public records and social media, I began to piece together the architecture of my son's life. He wasn't just successful, he was recklessly ambitious. And in that ambition, I knew I would find his weakness. The crack in the facade. It came in the form of a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was David's primary business partner, a man with a reputation for charm that concealed a gambler's soul. He left a trail of ruined partners and leveraged deals in his wake. I discovered that he and David were neck-deep in a high-stakes real estate venture they'd named the Oakwood Development. Their plan was to purchase a large tract of seemingly worthless scrubland on the outskirts of the city and have it rezoned for a luxury housing development. Everything hinged on that rezoning. My own plan, once a nebulous desire for retribution, began to crystallize. It was a delicate, intricate tapestry I would weave from threads of deceit, manipulation, and their own towering arrogance. The first thread was the creation of a new identity. Goodbye, Eleanor Vance, impoverished grandmother. Hello, Isabelle Dubois, a wealthy, eccentric widow from Montreal, recently relocated and looking for interesting investment opportunities. I used the last of the money from the sale of Richard's watch to purchase a few key items from a high-end consignment store, a classic trench coat, a designer handbag, and a pair of elegant, low-heeled shoes. I practiced a new, more refined way of speaking, my voice softer, with a hint of a French-Canadian accent I'd perfected by listening to language tapes from the library. My theater of operations became the world David and Marcus inhabited, the charity galas, the art auctions, the high-end restaurants. My quiet, unassuming demeanor, my air of someone with more money than sense, was the perfect bait. It didn't take long. Marcus Thorne, with his predator's instinct for easy money, noticed me. He made his approach at a fundraising dinner for the city's opera. His smile was as oily and cloying as the slick of crude oil that, as I discovered from geological surveys in the city archives, lay dormant and unmentioned beneath the soil of the Oakwood development site. He spoke of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to get in on the ground floor of a project that would reshape the city's future. I played my part to perfection. I was Isabel, the gullible widow, my eyes wide with a carefully calibrated mixture of excitement and feigned naivete. I listened to his slick, well-rehearsed lies, my heart pounding in my chest not with fear, but with the cold, rhythmic beat of a war drum. He had no inkling that the woman he was so condescendingly attempting to swindle was the mother of his partner, a woman they had deemed worthless, less than nothing. The second, and most crucial, thread of my plan involved a man named Arthur Jenkins. My research had revealed that David and Marcus had hired a small, independent environmental consulting firm to survey the Oakwood land, no doubt expecting a rubber-stamped approval. But one of their geologists, Arthur, had been a stickler for the truth. He'd been quietly fired weeks later, just after submitting a report detailing extensive soil and groundwater contamination on the site. I found Arthur. He was a quiet man, a birdwatcher who now spent his days volunteering at a local nature preserve. It took weeks to earn his trust. I joined the birdwatching society. I learned the difference between a finch and a sparrow. We spoke of migrating birds, of changing seasons, and eventually of the fragile ethics of the corporate world. I told him a story, a modified version of my own, about a family friend cheated by a powerful developer. I saw the spark of recognition, of shared injustice, in his eyes. He confessed that being fired had broken something in him, but he had kept a copy of his original, damning report. It was his proof, his wound. It was a ticking time bomb, and with a gentle, patient hand, he passed the detonator to me. I invested a sum of money into the Oakwood development through Marcus, a significant sum I had managed to pull together by taking a mortgage against my now fully owned house. It was a terrifying gamble, a move that could leave me utterly destitute. But this money was merely the grease for the gears of my machine. My true weapon was Arthur's report. The day of the city council meeting for the rezoning vote was a masterpiece of stagecraft. I sat in the back of the crowded public gallery, an anonymous woman in a simple coat, a ghost at the feast of their ambition. I watched as David and Marcus, exuding the smug confidence of men who believe they own the world, presented their polished proposal. They spoke of job creation, of community building, of a new vision for the future, their words dripping with the false promise of prosperity. Then, just as the council chairman was preparing to call for a vote, the dominoes began to fall. 24 hours earlier, I had anonymously couriered a package to every member of the city council, every investigative reporter at the major news outlets, and a prominent environmental watchdog group. The package contained a simple, undeniable item, Arthur Jenkins's original, unaltered environmental report. The effect was a controlled detonation. A council member's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face paling. A reporter in the front row received a message and whispered urgently to her cameraman. The room, once buzzing with polite anticipation, began to seethe with a new energy, the scent of scandal. The council chairman, now aware of the storm that was about to break, called for a sudden recess. The proposal wasn't just denied, it was annihilated, held up as an example of brazen corporate malfeasance. David and Marcus stood blindsided, their faces masks of disbelief as the cameras turned on them, the flashbulbs like a volley of gunfire. They were ruined. Their company imploded under the weight of lawsuits and a federal investigation. Their names became bywords for corruption. Marcus Thorne, hounded by creditors from his gambling debts, disappeared, reportedly fleeing the country. But my revenge was not yet complete. The final act was reserved for David and his wife. I knew Jennifer. I knew her devotion was to status, not to the man who provided it. The loss of their fortune, their standing, the automatic deference they commanded, that would be a wound from which their marriage could not recover. I watched from my invisible perch as the edifice of their perfect life crumbled. The creditors came, then the foreclosure notice. The for sale sign on their manicured lawn was the final, public tombstone. Jennifer, I learned through a well-placed conversation with her gossiping hairdresser, left him, taking what little remained of value and vanishing from his life as completely as he had from mine. The end, for me, came in the form of a late-night phone call a month later. It was David. His voice was a hoarse, broken whisper, stripped of all its former arrogance and cruel bravado. He was a man hollowed out, a man who had lost everything. He sobbed. He begged. He pleaded for forgiveness, for help, for his mother. I listened to his desperate pleas, my heart a cold, still stone in my chest. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, a vast, empty canyon between us. I thought of the woman he had discarded. I thought of the loneliness, the fear, and the $100 insult that had ignited the fire. I thought of Isabelle Dubois, and I smiled. When his ragged sobs had finally subsided, when there was nothing left but the sound of his pathetic, hitching breaths on the other end of the line, I spoke. My voice was calm, clear, and utterly serene. "I'm sorry," I said, the words a final, irrevocable severing of the cord that had once bound us. "I don't know who you are. You must have the wrong number." I hung up the phone. The profound silence of my small, neat apartment enveloped me, a comforting blanket. I had lost a son, yes, but I had regained something far more precious, myself. My future was uncertain, a blank page waiting to be written. I walked over to my small desk and picked up a local newspaper I'd been reading. It contained a small article about a notoriously exploitative slumlord who was under investigation for mistreating his tenants, many of whom were elderly. He was known to be a man who felt himself untouchable. As I looked out at the city lights, a glittering web of stories and secrets twinkling in the darkness, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. And my work, I suspected, was far from over.
So, another story of my grandmother has ended. And be clicking here, you will have when more such stories.